Hello and welcome to Woman Up, the podcast series by Desperate Artwives. Woman Up is a podcast talking to women artists, creatives, art critics, feminist historians, activists and more. The series was conceived by Desperate Artwives founder Amy Dignam in collaboration with me, Susan Merrick. Desperate Artwives is a platform established in 2010 for women artists who are also mothers and carers. Amy's work focuses on domestic disorder, unsteady identity, power and dysfunction. And I'm an artist interested in feminism, language, power and access. In this platform, we share conversations with women that inspire us and our work, whilst producing a long-form content of resources for other people to access. Hello and welcome to Woman Up, the podcast series by Desperate Artwives. I'm Susan Merrick, and today I'm here with Rachel Fallon. Rachel is a visual artist who deals with themes of protection and defence in domestic realms and addresses the topic of motherhood and women's relationships to society. Rachel has a strong individual practice as well as a collaborative one. Hello, Rachel, and welcome.
Hello, Susan.
Hi, Rachel. I've worked with you a couple of times through Desperate Artwives, and we've met at, for example, the Filio exhibition we did together. And I love seeing your work and following what you do. For those listeners out there who don't know much about you, please could you give me a little bit of a background to you as an artist and tell us about your practice and where it comes from?
Oh, goodness. Background is somewhat different to most people, I suppose. I didn't really go to art school. I never did art in school itself. So I had studied, I'd always made work, as in I'd always made little things and sewn little things and drawn, and that was kind of my big thing as a child. But it was very much sort of, no, you need a real job and do something else. So I had gone and studied film, which I suppose is in a way quite linked, but had worked in the film industry and didn't find it was very good for me in terms of it was a lot of very hectic long hours and moving around. And I was quite young as well at that time. I was 17 when I worked as a casting assistant on The Commitments. And it was just really full on, and I found it didn't suit me. So I went off and did various other things, like worked for an interior designer and worked in the UK, and came back and was drawing and painting murals in pubs in Galway and working in a bar when I met a circus, and they were going back to Germany, and they asked me if I wanted to come with them and do some work with them, posters and set design and various different things like that. So I did. They were going, 24 hours later, and I packed my bag. I was all of just about 22 or 23, packed my bag, went down, got on the freighter and went to the south of France with them, and ended up in Berlin. So really my background is a bit all over the place. And then, I'd worked with the circus for quite a long time, doing props and working on costumes and traveling around. And I decided I wanted to do more of my own work. So a lot of my beginning work when I was in my early 20s was large-scale watercolors, but a lot of them were around very feminist issues. And I would, exhibit in Berlin, but I'd also put some into the back of my car and drive over to Ireland and sell them in a gallery in Galway in Ireland. So it was a bit mad for a few years. And then I had my children and I continued to do a bit of work here and there, but it became increasingly difficult. And I didn't want to do large scale watercolors or anything else like that anymore, because those are things that are quite hard to pick up and let down. So I started to make things again, which I'd always done, and started really with, making pieces with my children together, making toys and things for them to play with, and a big dinosaur for somebody's birthday that could be taken apart and buried in the garden. And I just really, really liked working that way again. And I started to get back making things. So that was really how that's my very, very strange background to art. Yeah.
I love that you literally ran off with the circus, Rachel. That is brilliant.
It was a really good learning ground because you had to have things ready. I mean, these were people who were incredibly good at what they did. A lot of them had worked, and some of them were the original initiators from Cirque du Soleil and had worked with Archaeos and various other European circuses. So it was it was a modern circus. There was no animals, but they were extremely skilled professionals, and they had a very, very high level of quality. So the work that you had to do for them was, had to be really good. And that was just such a good training ground because there was if something had to be ready, it had to be ready. There was no messing about, and it had to work. And as somebody who does a lot of sculptural work, that's a really, really good thing to learn how to deal with that sort of pressure.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a fantastic background, and also a really not only chaotic, but in an exciting chaotic, I think, but an amazing way to travel as well around Europe and see part of that part of the world.
Yeah, it was it was really exciting, but there also, there came a time when I realized because you travel so much, you don't actually belong to a life. You always can pack up and move on, and that's not necessarily a good thing. So once I had my children, that was really hard. First of all, we lived in Berlin, and then we moved to the Dutch border, and then eventually I moved to Ireland. And each time it was setting up and starting again, especially with the family. And things are very, based around trying to get your children sorted in that moment, and everything else takes a back seat. So it was quite a struggle to set up making work, and also to find that peer group that a lot of people engender through being in college just wasn't there. So I really had to start searching for various different groups, and that was how I came across Desperate Artwives online. I saw an article in The Guardian, and I just thought, okay, this is what I need, and really, really cheekily wrote an email to Amy and said, I'm over here in Ireland. Can I be part of your group? And it really was a lifeline. Like, it was terribly, terribly important to me at that time to have people who were working in the same medium and had the same concerns as I had, because at the time it was quite an uncool thing to be making work about. And not that bothered me, that wasn't the reason. I really felt compelled to make work about motherhood and about the roles of women and about the roles of mothers within the society. But it just wasn't something that people were looking to show or were terribly interested in seeing. So actually getting peer critique and getting feedback and, working with other people who were very interested in this area was just such an amazing boon. Like, it really, really was incredibly helpful.
Yeah, that's it reminds me of a conversation we had with Helen Sargent last year, who in terms of having to change practice quite dramatically after having children. She too was previously working with paint, and she just said, you can't work with wet materials when you've got young children around. It's completely impractical. And so I really love that the more parent artists, mother artists that I speak to, there's all these running themes of how our practice is molded really practically around the time resources we have, but also the materials that are available and that work when you have got young children around you.
It is. I mean, it's hugely efficient. I think you become incredibly efficient at mining those little hours of space or even 10, 15 minutes of space that you might have. And I have done terrible things which health and safety would probably murder me for, like make waxes while I'm cooking the dinner, which is probably not a very good idea. But I was hugely under pressure to get them made for a bronze casting trip I was doing. So, there are things which become quite surreal. Like, it really is quite funny. And I do enjoy that aspect of it. The kind of how bonkers it can be, trying to wrestle with the child in one hand and trying to make something on the other hand, and how they all feed into one another. I think that's incredibly rich as well. These limitations that that are put on you, you just have to be very conscious that they're there, but also it's incredibly enriching to find a way around them. There's a bit of a, fingers up to the world in that way when you manage to do it anyway.
I think that's a really interesting statement, actually, Rachel, because I feel quite similar, probably because my practice began after having children already, so I didn't really have a practice before I had kids. So mine has always been about, right, okay, what do I do and how do I do it around what I can? And it, like you, makes you very efficient, and the pressure for me, like you, can really change it can basically up my risk taking a bit, and make me do things when I have the time. So I don't have the time to think myself out of things. I'll just quickly go and do a performance or film something, or I go and do it, and I'll have a lot of time to think about things, maybe afterwards or before, but during the moment it's getting it done. Whereas I think some people maybe it doesn't work like that, and the pressure of it just can really limit their practice, can feel really limited. And I think it's really important to talk about both aspects and show for those who maybe are in a period of fear, or in a period of time when things just feel so limited, to know that it might not always feel like that, and actually you can be really you can still produce really exciting and strong work through those limitations, and by moving through that and with it, I think.
Well, I think it's really interesting. I mean, I love subversions of things, and my work is very often about subverting things, but I came across a couple of years ago a phrase, like there's, no good deed goes unpunished. Well, there's one that says a job worth doing is worth doing badly. And I really liked that, because really what it was referencing was the fact that it's worth doing 10 minutes of it. It's 10 minutes is better than nothing at all. And waiting for the time to be perfect is never going to happen. And I think you just become quite ruthless in that way, about saying, okay, I've got this 10 minutes, I'm going to use them. And you kind of throw yourself out of the window a little bit, or I know I do anyway. And I just grab hold of things and try to do them, which if I had more time, I most definitely would not. I would overanalyze it, and I would probably become quite neurotic about it. So I do think that learning to deal with that level of just, doing and not thinking too much. It's a bit like that Sol LeWitt letter to Eva Hesse, just do it. It does actually make an awful lot of sense in that way. And it's never going to be perfect. There's never going to be the right time.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about some specific works of yours, if that's okay, Rachel.
Absolutely.
So I think I'd love to start talking initially about Aprons of Power, because this is a work that I've seen most recently, as one of your pieces, one of your images is in the Desperate Artwives project, the M Wall, which is travelling the UK at the moment. So could you tell me and the listeners a bit more about this project, where it came from, what you've done, and where it's going?
Well, Aprons of Power it's a funny one. It really is. There's personal and political and various different things. It's quite a layered project. It came to, on one side, out of the campaign, the Artist campaign to repeal the Eighth Amendment, which was a group that I was part of, where we were campaigning against the Eighth Amendment in Ireland, which was a terribly prohibitive law around abortion and women's rights, and really around bodily consent for women, because even women who wanted to have their children, they were denied consent over their own bodies, basically, because they were pregnant. So, it wasn't purely about the right to an abortion, although that was a very large part of it, but it was also around a right to bodily consent, because a woman's own life was equated to that of her unborn fetus. And in that moment, she basically had less rights than the fetus, and in the legal terminology. And it created huge problems in Ireland. And it was a very, very draconian law. And this had been passed in 1983, and there was possibilities through the Citizens' Assembly to actually change this this law. So myself and 4 incredible artists who set up the campaign, Cecily Brennan, Alice Marr, Ethna Jordan, and the poet Paula Meehan, they had set up a campaign, and I had joined them along with, 3,000 other signatories, but we had, a small group of us had made banners, and we had paraded them at the annual March for Choice every year that was going ahead. And then we had arranged for the Eva Biennale, which was being held in the same year as the referendum, that we would take over the streets in Limerick where the Biennale was being held. It's Ireland's only international Biennale. And the streets had been, used by the Redemptorists, which was a religious order, to march men up and down the roads in the 1930s and 40s for religious reasons, to march them up and down as part of confraternities, which were basically seen as armies of God. And women were not allowed to be involved. So we had reused these routes from an old Magdalen laundry, and the Magdalen laundries were where women were basically incarcerated because they had children out of wedlock, and this was seen as a particularly bad thing to do in the Ireland of the time. So we created a commemorative route with these banners from this laundry, which was now, funnily enough and ironically enough, the Art College in Limerick, over to the place where they were being held. And this was along the main streets in Limerick. So it was actually quite interesting, because there were a lot of, anti-choice placards pinned up to the walls and everything else like that. So it was a very interesting time. But the aprons I had been working on kind of part way for my own practice and part to tie into this performance that we had planned. And then my studio burnt down. And I had originally very different aprons in mind. And when the studio burnt down, everything was gone. It had been a studio I'd set up with 7 other women artists, and we had, children and dogs, and everybody could come after school and whatever. And it was brilliant, but everything was gone. Except for one piece, which La Bafana, which managed to survive, which is very strange. But anyway, I digress. I had 1 bolt of linen left over, which I just happened to have at home. And I thought, okay, sod this, I'll make the aprons out of that. And the aprons were a very personal thing, because aprons, for me, when I was growing up, it was something. I have 4 sisters, and I'm from a family of 7 children. So, aprons were what you put on, so there wasn't too much washing, so you didn't spill things all down yourself when you were doing things in the house. My brothers never had to wear aprons, strangely enough. But also, there was a lot of things around eating. I was a very picky eater as a child, and my apron had a pocket in it. So anything I didn't want to eat, I'd put into that. So there was a whole kind of personal thing around whether aprons were good or bad. I didn't particularly like them, but I had come across a reference when I was researching the Magdalen projects of how the women, when they arrived into the laundries, their names were changed, their hair was cut off, their clothes were taken, and they were given like a sack-like dress, an apron, a hat, and boots. And it was just this whole idea around these aprons being something, that was like a cover-up and a cover-all, and you use them for domestic duties. So I went off and researched aprons, and I actually came across some really, really fascinating history, because aprons are actually a male thing. When you look at the whole ideology of aprons, especially in things like the Freemasons, it's from an Adamic tradition. So that's what was used to cover up Adam and Eve. So they're incredibly important in that respect. Most religions have some sort, the Pharaoh in Egypt wore an apron. There's a whole talk in the Bible about this, amazing apron that was studded with gold and gems. The Pope wears an apron. It's called a grimial. So it's actually a huge male power symbol of covering the genitals. And I found that really fascinating. So I wanted to use that, and I wanted to use this whole idea of the anasirmana, this lifting of the skirts, or this showing of the vulva, which, you have in the Sheila na gig in Ireland, and in lots of traditional places like China, you know, they lifted at the Chinese wall, the women lifted their skirts to make the invaders, you know, flee. And, you know, more recently at the Shell oil pipe in Nigeria, the Igbo women lifted their skirts. And basically it was a cursing of people back to where they came from. And I loved this idea of these women who had been so repressed that they were able to lift, you know, this apron, that it was some show of power, that this thing that had been, you know, given to them as a show of subservience, that it actually became something quite powerful. So I found this silk, which was incredibly expensive, and the sort of silk that you would use for Desun. It was this beautiful pink color, and I sewed that on the inside. And then I took the mottos. I was really looking at the time, you know, for other work like mother medals and the maternal chain of office at military mottos. And I started to look at these really, you know, very patriarchal mottos that are used in armies today. And the first apron I made was from the Italian penitentiary guard. And it's, I won't, you know, make you listen to my really bad Italian, because poor Amy would be very upset. But it means to ensure hope is our role. So they're actually, a lot of these military mottos are quite, you know, uplifting things. And I wanted to use them in this show of power, but a show of feminine power. And that's what I did. And they were part of this, of the procession. So the women marched, 6 people of, you know, friends of mine who were chosen for this and who have all been involved in campaigning, wore the aprons, were really amazing, did a beautiful performance. And then at the end, when they got to the end of the procession, there was a beautiful song from Breda Mayock, and they all lifted the aprons. And it was a really powerful moment. It was a really, really interesting moment. And then after that, I had done sort of solo performances where I stood out. I used them in a piece called Aprons of Power, Places of Power, and I went to sites of power in Dublin, the capital city in Ireland, like Holles Street, which is the National Maternity Hospital, where there's been lots of, you know, controversies about various different things, not least about the Eighth Amendment, but also about other things. And I stood out there with one of the aprons and held it up. And then places where the laundries, where the women striked, and the laundries for holiday pay, because they had no holiday pay, and various other places like the Magdalen Laundry and things like that. So and now the collection, the 6 aprons have been collected by the Arts Council. So I'm really glad that they will be looked after, and I don't have to worry if my studio burns down that they're in it.
That's fantastic to hear about, Rachel. Thank you. It's such powerful imagery, and even more of a powerful backdrop, really, I think, to the story. And amazing that the Arts Council have them as part of their collection now as well. You mentioned a couple of times there the really tragic fire that you suffered at the studio. How would you feel about telling us a bit about that, and about how you've, how you've kind of, as artists, how you've recovered from that, and what you're able to do in terms of workspaces and stuff now?
Well, the fire was quite a shock, as you might think. And it was really, we had been very lucky. We had set up this studio, a bit along the lines of Mother House. It had been set up in 2014. And it was a place where there was 8 women artists. We had all worked together in various constellations in a couple of collaborations, one collaboration, the Tellurometer Project, and another collaboration, Raft, and I had been part of both of those. And we had searched for quite a long time. I think in about 2013, we had decided we really, really wanted to set up the studios together in a way where we were visible within the community, because all of us live in this particular community, and we wanted to actually work within our community, rather than constantly where I live. It's like a satellite town, so it would be near enough to the city, and everybody goes to the city to go to work. And we felt as artists it would actually be really good for our community if we were a visible presence, that artists weren't always this sort of special people who were, somehow apart from their locality. So we set about putting together this studio, and we eventually found a county council building that couldn't be let in any other way. And we moved in, and it was wonderful. I mean, for the years that it lasted, I think we had it 3 years altogether. It was around the corner from most of the children's schools, so they could come back after school and do their homework. There were people who didn't have children but had dogs. I had both. So it became this mad place where people could come in and out. But it was also really, really important for us to set up a kind of network for a wider community, because there's lots of artists in this area, but there's not really a lot of connection between them. So he had set up a salon night and a reading group, and we did a series of talks and all various kind of program for other people to kind of, not necessarily, we didn't have the resources for them to utilize the studios, but definitely to come in and network and communicate and tell about their own practice and whatever. So when it did go, that was really, really hard. Not even in terms of the material resources, which we all lost, because we all lost archives and work. And, a lot of my work that I would have shown with Desperate Artwives, be it the Mother Mask or the Infant Survival Set, all of that was gone. But on the other hand, and it was the loss of community that really was difficult to deal with. And we still run the salon night and the film club and the reading group, but from the local arts centre. But what was quite interesting was it did actually change my practice in a way again, because I had lost a solo show. I was supposed to do a solo show in the May of that year, and all that work was gone. So I had managed to move the dates for that show to the November of the same year, but it meant that I had about 6 months to do a show, which was slightly mad. And it was, running all around the place, but people were so helpful. Like one artist, a good friend of mine, lent me her studio, so that I was able to make the ladder, the Assumption, because it was 10 meters long, and I had a knitting machine that had belonged to my mother, which is actually really hard work. And, this piece was really, I needed somewhere that was relatively clean and big enough to be able to see what I was doing. Somebody else, another good friend of mine, he runs an iron casting research program called Iron Ore, and he basically had been thinking of not doing it, and then he said, no, you need to make work. So he put on Iron Ore, and that was how I made the maternal chain of office. So I was running down to Cork to get that done, and then coming back up, and people lent me, friends of mine lent me their studio once they realized I wouldn't kill myself with an angle grinder. That was fine. So people were incredibly kind in terms of, really helping me to pull that exhibition together. And it was really important for me to be able to put that together, because it just gave me a chance. Everything I'd had to show was gone. So it just gave me a chance to build a body of work in a very, very short period of time, like literally 4 months. And that body of work has been incredibly helpful to me, because it's, I'm showing it at the moment in an exhibition with 12 other feminist artists around the whole idea of body in Ireland, and, the last 30 years in Ireland, how women's rights have changed. So, it's funny, that whole sense of community that is galvanized into action, and various other artists from the studios have done amazing work in the time, made huge jumps in their practice in the time since the fire. So where it was devastating, there are also good things that come out of these things as well. And I think having at least the chance to keep together as a community, because we still meet up and, we're still looking for a premises, that theoretical premises. It's just a bit difficult at the moment to find one, but I've been very lucky. I was offered a place in studios in Tala, which is another wonderful community in the Arts Centre there, for 2 years to finish a project there, because it's a very large scale project that I'm working on. But everybody's found sort of an interim home for the moment, but we would still like to, go back to our original idea of, keeping the community going and being present in the community. I think that's really important, that artists aren't seen as some sort of elite.
Totally agree with you, Rachel. We're doing something quite similar here in Aldershot. There's quite a few artists and creatives in the area. Most people have had to look elsewhere for work or go outside of the area, and we're really trying to bring in a local focus at the moment. Before we finish, I would really like to hear a bit. You talked about the maternal chain of office and the mother medals, which I know how you've done over the last couple of years. And the bigger project that you've got on at the moment. I'd just love to hear a little bit about your current work and what the motivations are for that.
The current work, meaning the mother medals, and a lot of the work around, the maternal chain of office is really about austerity, I suppose, because it's, the full name of it is the Maternal Chain of Office, the Order of Our Blessed Lady of the Food Bank. I think, a lot of my work, when I look back, be it La Befana, be it the various different pieces, also Our Lady of Picky Eaters and earlier works like that, they are a lot about, very existential things as a mother, being able to feed your child, being able to provide shelter for your child. And they're not necessarily, some of my work is kind of about my own. I was a terribly picky eater as a child. I must have been very hard to actually feed. And it's not until you have your own children you realize how thwarting that is, because, being a mother, you want to nurture. And if you can't do that, it's very, very difficult. So the maternal chain of office is really, it's about a lot of information and a lot of knowledge that I kind of researched and imbibed in a way when I lived in Germany, and in particular in Berlin, talking to a lot of the women who had lived through the war there, and how important food was and what a role it played in society, and what how important it was to be able to feed your children, especially when any women were in camps or in various different things like that. And later I was looking at the research of some other people, like the Unwomanly Face of War, Svetlana Alexievich, who writes first person oral histories from women who were on the Russian front. And it really, an awful lot of these things are just really very, very basic things. And when you look at what austerity is doing to families, and in particular to women and children in Ireland and in the UK and all through Europe, and, women who are fleeing from war and families who are fleeing from war, you realize how, we really need to look at people being fed. And this work, the maternal chain, is made, they were originally cake boards, the silver kind of coconut, compressed coconut board cake plates that people put their occasional cakes on. So I carved all of those and then sand cast them in iron, iron being sort of one of those really funny metals, which I kind of love because it's got domestic and military purposes. So it really is those two things. And I cast them in iron, and then used curtain rings to attach them all one to the other. But all the tokens are bread tokens, or tokens that were used during the war to swap for food. So that was kind of that is, and it's an incredibly heavy piece, like it weighs nearly 50 kilos. So even transporting it becomes quite problematical, but it really is about that sort of very basic burden in a way of trying to fulfill all these needs, especially when everything around you is trying to stop you from fulfilling those needs. And the medals are around that whole ideology of the, pronatalist movement, which was very popular in Europe at the beginning of the last century, and right up until, even now they still have the medal for the family in France. And these were medals that were given to women for having a certain number of children. And in some cases, in Russia or the Ukraine, you had to raise your youngest child to 15 before they actually got the medal. But perversely, the medals were also awarded in that moment when you lost a child for the father or motherland. So, these medals that are awarded for birth and death, there's something quite perverse and quite awful about it in a way, and what that actually means. So those medals were made in felt because I wanted something that was very, against that whole idea of the memorializing of these things. So they're quite soft and they're embroidered, and then they're mounted on sponges because, again, I really like the idea that they would be quite colourful in that way that icons are, that they'd be quite eye-catching, but when you come up you realise, it's a bit of a Pyrrhic thing, it's not really what you thought it was. And I think that's what a lot of these, sort of ideology around, awarding things, it really is quite false. So yeah, I'm building on a lot. I think the work at the moment is also, there's a collaborative project that I'm doing with another artist, Alice Maher, and that is around the whole idea of the Magdalene. So it's part of a larger project, and that work is it will be very large scale. So we're in the middle of production at the moment, and there's a lot of handwork, there's a lot of labour. I'm quite interested in this whole idea of, how women's, they had not so many options in earlier times, and how sewing and labour, this sort of huge manual labour, was very much, one of the ways of keeping your head above water and being respectable, and how difficult that is. Like, it looks so beautiful and delicate, but it's actually very, very hard work. And this was another thing that, as part of the Magdalene laundries, a lot of the women would labour. They would do washing and they would do laundry work. But the ones who were good at sewing, they were given a lot of, fine work to do, and that was sold off and they never got paid for it.
Rachel, thank you. It's been so interesting to hear about your work. And I think I want to have several more conversations with you outside of our interview, because I just could keep talking to you all day. But a great big thank you for coming and talking to us. And we'll speak to you again soon, I hope.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's really been a complete honour. Thank you so much.
This was Woman Up, the podcast series by Desperate Artwives. I'm Susan Merrick, and we'll see you in the next episode.